Welcome back to Mind Waves Talk. If you're enjoying these deep dives, do us a favor and hit that like button, share the episode with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future episodes. Today, we're taking a look at a place that's been in the news a lot, a region that's seen its fair share of conflict. Afghanistan.
Yeah, and it's not just recent history. We're talking about a place that's been called the graveyard of empires.
The graveyard of empires.
That's right, empires throughout history. I mean, from Alexander the Great to the British Empire
Oh, wow.
to the Soviets in more recent times. Conquering Afghanistan, well, it's proven to be a challenge, to say the least.
Which makes you wonder, what is it about Afghanistan that makes it so resistant to control? Is it the terrain, the people, or something else entirely?
That's a great question.
That's what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
We're going to trace the history of Afghanistan back to its earliest days to see if we can understand why it's been such a tough nut to crack for so many powerful forces.
Well, to do that, we need to go way back, even before the empires we typically think of. Around 3000 BCE, Afghanistan was actually part of the Indus Valley civilization.
Really?
Yes, and we're not just talking about nomadic tribes here. We're talking advanced urban settlements.
Wow.
Places like Mundagak, and there's Balkh, which is nicknamed the Mother of Cities.
The mother of cities
Yeah.
in Afghanistan.
These show evidence of, really sophisticated societies in a region that many people today just picture as, barren mountains and desert.
Right, yeah. That already challenges the image I think a lot of us have in our mind of Afghanistan. So what made these early civilizations so successful?
Well, one key factor was trade. The early Silk Road, that network of trade routes,
Yeah.
it actually started connecting Afghanistan with the rest of the world centuries ago. Think goods, ideas, religions, everything flowed through this region. It made Afghanistan a cultural crossroads.
So not just surviving, but thriving as a hub.
Exactly. But it also brings up a question, this constant flow of people and ideas, did that also make it difficult to create a unified, stable power base within Afghanistan itself?
That's a really good point, and it kind of makes me think about all the different empires and groups that have tried to control Afghanistan throughout its history. Did they all face that same challenge?
You're hitting on something that really echoes throughout Afghan history.
Okay.
Take the Achaemenid Persian Empire in the 6th century BCE. They brought with them Zoroastrianism, adding another layer to the already kind of diverse religious landscape.
Right.
But even they couldn't completely dominate. The Afghan tribes, especially in the mountainous regions, maintained a really fierce independence.
So even a powerful empire like the Persians couldn't fully subdue the Afghans, which of course brings us to the guy who thought he could conquer anything, Alexander the Great.
Right, the 4th century BCE.
I'm guessing Afghanistan gave him a run for his money.
Absolutely. Oh, the Afghan tribes were not impressed by Alexander's, reputation.
Okay.
He faced relentless resistance. In fact, he couldn't subdue them completely through force alone. So, in a fascinating twist, he ended up marrying Roxana, a local princess, as a way to try and unify the region.
So even Alexander the Great had to resort to diplomacy and integration, huh? It makes you wonder if that approach might have worked better for later empires who tried to control Afghanistan.
That's a really interesting thought, and it's something to keep in mind as we move forward in our deep dive.
Okay.
Because after Alexander's death, his empire fractured, and the region was then ruled by the Seleucid dynasty and then the Greco-Bactrians, who actually brought Greek culture with them.
Okay.
And this created these really amazing cultural fusions.
Fusions, okay.
We see it in their art, blending Greek and Indian elements.
Right, so again, that blending of cultures that we talked about earlier. But with all the shifting power, all these different empires coming and going, it doesn't really sound like there was ever a truly Afghan empire that rose to dominate the region in these early centuries.
You're right to point that out. Afghanistan was often a part of larger empires, but there wasn't a strong centralized Afghan state that emerged during this time.
Okay.
Then, in the 1st century CE, the Kushan Empire came onto the scene. They controlled a huge area from India to Central Asia.
Wow.
And they were instrumental in spreading Buddhism along the Silk Road.
Buddhism.
Yes. So now we're adding Buddhism to the mix of Zoroastrianism and the other beliefs that were already present. Afghanistan's religious diversity at this point must have been incredible.
Yeah, wow. Are there any remnants of this period of the Kushan Empire and the spread of Buddhism that still exist today?
Well, sadly, not as many as there once were. But one of the most powerful symbols of this era were the Bamiyan Buddhas.
Oh, wow.
Those colossal statues carved into cliffs. They stood for centuries, as a testament to Afghanistan's role in this cultural and religious exchange.
And their destruction in 2001 by the Taliban was a devastating loss, not just for Afghanistan, but really for the world. It's such a stark reminder of how fragile cultural heritage can be, especially in times of conflict. And speaking of the Taliban, they've become almost synonymous with Afghanistan in recent decades, right?
That's right.
So how did this group emerge? What are their roots?
Well, we have to jump ahead quite a bit to the 1990s, to the aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan War.
Okay.
The country was in chaos, just utter chaos, and out of this turmoil came the Taliban, which actually means students.
Students.
Yeah. Their ideology is based on an extremely strict interpretation of Islamic law.
Oh, wow.
And they imposed this very strictly on the Afghan people when they took power.
And that rule was notoriously harsh, particularly for women and girls. I think for many listeners today, it might be hard to grasp just how much control the Taliban exerted over daily life in Afghanistan during that time.
It was truly restrictive. Girls were forbidden from going to school, women couldn't work, and they were forced to wear the burqa, completely covering themselves.
Wow.
The Taliban's vision of society was incredibly rigid and unforgiving.
So we've got this complex history, ancient civilizations, trade routes, empires rising and falling, all this diverse religious influence.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And then on top of that, this incredibly harsh regime takes hold with the Taliban. And then, of course, comes 9/11, which completely changes the global landscape and thrusts Afghanistan onto the center stage of world events.
And that changes everything.
So that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive into Afghanistan. We'll delve into the complexities of the U.S. intervention and its aftermath. But for now, I think we have a pretty clear picture of how Afghanistan's unique geography and its position as this cultural crossroads have shaped its long and often very tumultuous history. Stay with us as we unpack the more recent chapters of this fascinating, challenging story.
Welcome back
To our deep dive into the history of Afghanistan.
We left off with the U.S. launching Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001, aiming to reshape Afghanistan after 9/11.
Right, it seemed very decisive at the time, but looking back, how successful was this initial phase of the intervention?
Well, the U.S. and its allies did quickly topple the Taliban regime.
Okay.
They were driven from power and forced to retreat into the mountains and across the border into Pakistan.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda camps were targeted, and they began efforts to establish a new Afghan government.
But it wasn't just a clean break, right? It's not like the Taliban just disappeared.
No.
What were some of those early signs that this intervention might become a much longer and more complex undertaking than perhaps initially thought?
You're right. The seeds of a long conflict were sown early on. The Taliban, though pushed back, they began to regroup and reorganize.
Oh, yeah.
They launched an insurgency using guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, roadside bombs.
So they really adapted quickly.
They did.
Good.
And it wasn't just about military victories, right? There was this whole other side of the intervention.
That whole winning hearts and minds idea.
Exactly. How did the U.S. approach that?
Right, yeah.
That was a huge challenge.
It sounds like it.
There was this idea of nation building, creating a stable, democratic Afghanistan.
Okay.
But it was incredibly difficult to implement.
In what ways?
Well, there were issues of corruption within the Afghan government, struggles to provide basic services to the population, and deep-seated tribal and ethnic divisions that were just really hard to overcome.
It sounds like the U.S. was trying to impose a very specific vision of what Afghanistan should be, maybe without fully understanding all of those complexities on the ground.
That's a critique that's often leveled at the intervention, yeah. There is this sense that the U.S., with its Western ideals and its limited experience in Afghan culture and politics, was trying to create a mini-America in a place that was, well, fundamentally different.
And this whole time, the Taliban are rebuilding, adapting their tactics, becoming more and more, well, entrenched, I guess. Was the U.S. military prepared for this kind of long-term asymmetrical warfare?
That's a good question, and it's a point of debate, The U.S. military, incredibly effective in conventional warfare.
Right.
But the war in Afghanistan required a very different approach. Well, counterinsurgency, winning over the population, building trust. These weren't necessarily the U.S. military strengths, at least not traditionally.
It's interesting because we often hear about the Taliban's brutality, of course.
Right.
But they also seem to be very effective at playing the long game, exploiting weaknesses, waiting for their opponents to make mistakes.
Exactly. They were patient, they were resilient,
Yeah.
and they understood the terrain and the local dynamics better than any foreign force ever could. I mean, that's really key.
Absolutely. Now, we have two documentaries that I think really delve into the nitty-gritty of this period, and they're called The Complete History of the Afghanistan War documentary, Part 1 and Part 2. What are some of the key insights they offer about how the war unfolded?
Well, these documentaries, they provide a very comprehensive look at the conflict, from the initial invasion to the long and really difficult years that followed.
Cool.
And they highlight the challenges faced by both sides, the human cost of the war, and the just sheer complexities of trying to rebuild a nation that's been shattered by decades of conflict.
They also feature interviews with soldiers, civilians, experts,
Right, real people.
which gives us a much more human perspective on the war.
It does.
We see the toll it takes on everyone involved, the moral dilemmas, the sacrifices that were made.
It's important to remember that behind the headlines and all the geopolitical maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are profoundly affected by these events.
And those human stories can get lost in the larger narrative of war sometimes, can't they?
They do.
One of the most dramatic and controversial events of the war was, of course, the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011.
Right.
Did that feel like a turning point at the time?
It was a significant moment, for sure.
Yeah.
It was seen as a huge victory for the U.S.,
Right.
eliminating the mastermind behind 9/11. But it didn't bring an end to the war.
It didn't.
No. In fact, the Taliban's insurgency continued, and the U.S. remained deeply entangled in the conflict.
So even taking out the leader of al-Qaeda didn't fundamentally change the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. It makes you wonder, what were the real goals of the U.S. intervention, and were they ever achievable?
That's a question that historians and policymakers will continue to debate for years to come.
Yeah.
The U.S. intervention in Afghanistan was incredibly complex, with shifting objectives, unforeseen challenges, and unintended consequences.
And while the U.S. was grappling with its strategy in Afghanistan, the Taliban were constantly evolving, right?
Yes.
Learning from their mistakes and becoming an even more, I guess formidable is the word, force.
Exactly. They weren't just a ragtag group of fighters anymore.
Right.
They were developing a sophisticated political and military strategy,
Okay.
exploiting the weaknesses of the Afghan government and gaining influence in rural areas.
And all of this sets the stage for the dramatic events of 2021. The U.S. withdrawal and the Taliban's return to power, which we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back to Mindwaves Talk.
And the final chapter of our deep dive into Afghanistan.
We've covered a lot of ground, from ancient empires to the rise of the Taliban to the long U.S. intervention.
Right, a lot of history.
And now we get to 2021, a year that I think many thought or hoped would mark a turning point for Afghanistan.
Yeah, a new era.
But instead, we saw this really dramatic reversal, with the U.S. withdrawing and the Taliban swiftly regaining control.
The withdrawal, which began under the Trump administration and was completed under Biden, was a chaotic
And very controversial.
process, to say the least.
The images from Kabul airport with thousands of people desperately trying to flee the country
It was heartbreaking.
are seared into our collective memory.
They are.
What led to this rapid collapse of the Afghan government? I mean, after 20 years, after 2 decades of U.S. support and training.
Well, there are several factors at play.
Okay.
One is the deep-rooted corruption within the Afghan government.
Right.
Despite billions of dollars in aid, it failed to build trust with the population or provide essential services, and this created a vacuum that the Taliban were able to exploit.
So the Taliban, despite their brutal history, were able to kind of capitalize on the Afghan government's failures and present themselves as this viable alternative.
Exactly.
Wow.
And the Afghan security forces, despite years of training and equipment, they just lacked the will to fight.
They did.
Many soldiers simply melted away as the Taliban advanced,
Really?
unwilling to die for a government they saw as, well, corrupt and ineffective.
It's such a stark contrast to that, fierce resistance that Afghan tribes have shown throughout history.
Right. Think Alexander the Great.
Only facing foreign invaders, yeah.
Exactly.
This time, it seems like the fight was lost from within.
Yeah, that's a key insight. The Taliban, they understood Afghan society, its divisions, its grievances.
And they were able to exploit those weaknesses and mobilize support in ways that the U.S.-backed government never could.
That's right.
And the speed with which the Taliban took over was it was stunning.
It really was.
I mean, it got many intelligence agencies, including those in the U.S., completely off guard.
Yeah.
What were some of the miscalculations that led to this underestimation of the Taliban's strength?
Well, I think there was this belief that the Afghan government, with continued U.S. support, could hold its own against the Taliban.
Okay.
There is also this failure to fully grasp, the depth of popular discontent with the government
Right.
and the extent to which the Taliban had been able to infiltrate and influence, especially rural communities.
So the U.S. withdrawal, which was intended to mark an end to America's longest war, instead kind of became this symbol of its failures in Afghanistan.
In many ways, yes.
What are the long-term implications of this withdrawal, both for Afghanistan and for the U.S.'s, well, global standing?
Well, for Afghanistan, the Taliban's return to power has meant a return to a very different way of life, especially for women and girls. Their freedoms are once again severely restricted.
Right.
The economy is in shambles.
Right.
Foreign aid has been largely cut off, and millions are facing hunger and poverty.
It's a humanitarian crisis.
It is.
And for the U.S.
The withdrawal has damaged its credibility on the world stage, It's raised questions about the reliability of U.S. commitments
Okay.
and its ability to effectively manage these really complex interventions.
And hasn't it also emboldened other adversaries?
I think so, yes. Those who see the U.S. withdrawal as a sign of weakness, and it's left this power vacuum in the region that other actors like China and Russia are, well, eager to fill.
So the story of Afghanistan, clearly it's far from over. The Taliban now face this, enormous challenge of governing a country that's been ravaged by decades of war and is facing, like you said, this humanitarian crisis.
They have a lot on their plate.
They've promised a more moderate rule this time around.
We'll see.
But actions often speak louder than words,
Yeah.
right? And there are already reports of human rights abuses,
Right.
crackdowns on dissent, and a return to many of the harsh practices that, well, marked their previous reign.
It's a concerning situation.
It seems like this cycle of violence and oppression that has plagued Afghanistan for so long, it's not easily broken.
It's a deeply ingrained cycle.
What can we as individuals, as people who have, been following this story, what can we learn from Afghanistan's tumultuous history?
Well, I think one crucial takeaway is the importance of humility in foreign policy.
Okay.
The belief that you can just impose a Western model of democracy on a country with such a different history and culture has proven to be, well, misguided.
We also see the danger of underestimating our adversaries.
For sure.
The Taliban were often dismissed as this, backward ragtag group, but they proved to be shrewd, patient, and incredibly resilient.
They really did.
And I think, finally, we're reminded of the human cost of war. The Afghan people have endured decades of conflict, suffering, and their resilience in the face of all of this adversity is truly remarkable.
It is.
So as we conclude this deep dive, we're left with this sense of, both sadness and hope.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Sadness for the immense suffering that has been endured, but hope that the Afghan people, after so much turmoil, can finally find a path to peace and stability.
It's what they deserve. The journey ahead will be long and arduous.
Yeah, it will be.
But the Afghan people have shown time and again their strength and determination.
They have.
We can only hope that the future holds a brighter chapter for them.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through Afghanistan's complex history. I hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking.
If you enjoyed it, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Mindwaves Talk for more deep dives.
And until next time, keep those mind waves flowing.